Our next session is a panel discussion. We are very privileged to have participants that are coming from a variety of sectors. The South African Poultry Association, the Red Meat Abattoir Association, the South African Processed Meat Association, the Dairy Standards Agency. We also have the Consumer Goods Council, and we have the food service sector represented by Jane Russell. So please, ladies and gentlemen, won't you join me on the stage? Okay, now the purpose for this discussion was to stop and reflect on what we are doing as industry, because I'm sure that you are sitting there thinking, but we do have, audits taking place. I know that in order to supply the retailer, I have to jump through 7 hoops. I am taking samples of product, I am testing it, and there are programs in place to assist. So we thought that instead of speaking to you individually, we would ask associations that represent your interests, hopefully, in terms of what they are actually doing to try and support industry with regards to pathogen control, not just Listeria, as we've heard today. Thank you so much. So I have prepared a set of questions, and how we did these questions was really to go to our database, our users, and say, we will be conducting a panel discussion, and what questions would you like to ask on behalf of industry? So the questions that we have here are really coming from people that have genuine questions that they would like to have answers to. So before we start with the interrogation, I'm going to first ask each member on the panel to briefly introduce themselves. And you might have seen we're quite active on Twitter. When you do a tweet, you are restricted in the number of characters that you can use. So I'm going to ask the panel to please tweet. And they're going to tell us just very briefly the organization that they represent and how they support the sector that they're actually representing today in terms of pathogen control and Listeria guidance. So I'm going to start on that side with the leader, and we're going to go one by one. Gerard, you'll have to give up the everyone's got, oh wow, look how good these are. There's multiple mics. Leader, can you start, please?
Okay, it's SAMPA, South African Meat Processors Association. It's a voluntary association where stakeholders involved in meat processing could become members. Our involvement in the last 15 years would probably mostly be in SANS 885, which was incorporating other regulations that was already existing into a processing standard, which was the focus was mostly compulsory standards in composition. But pathogens and that was also written in, but it wasn't the main focus of the work we've done at that stage.
Perfect. Thanks, Anita.
Hello, I'm Jane Russell. I'm representing the food service industry, and that's quite a broad perspective. My previous life, I worked in the food service industry. I was intricately involved in setting up of standards for good hygiene practices in numerous kitchens where mass catering took place from. Subsequently, I've crossed over the line and I now work in the food distribution into food service. So how do we currently support our customers and the industry sector? Well, predominantly it's by setting standards for food safety and controls, both backward into the supply chain, working with suppliers to ensure that the product they are packaging and which gets moved around from place to place, from storage into vehicles and then into further storage and finally into use where for in-product production, that food safety standards are met and sustained and maintained and are improved continuously. So that's currently my position and my support for the industry.
Thanks, Jane. McLeod.
Hi, good day everyone. My name is Monocytogenes. I work for the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa. Basically what we do, we are a voluntary association. We are known to be manufacturer and retailer focused, but most of the people that are displaying there at the back are our members. So anyone that is in the food industry can become our member. So basically what we are the go-to person, we are the link between government and the industry in terms of communications, in terms of lobbying, in terms of advocacy, and we sit on the technical working group of the department whenever they need to develop new set of regulations. And we sit at the Food Legislative and Advisory Group of the Department of Health. So basically, we're just the go-to person. We are available daily, anytime they need. Yompi would say, Matlo, you know, you are a lifesaver, you are just so available. Thanks to my children, they are older now. Now I can be available to the members. So that's basically what we do. We are there to answer any question, and whatever that they need clarity on, we contact the relevant departments and get the feedback to them directly. Thank you.
Thanks, Matla. Yompi.
Good morning, everyone. It's Yompi Burger. I'm the managing director of the company called Dairy Standard Agency. We are a self-regulatory initiative of the organized dairy industry. We basically representing also the MPO, which is the Milk Producers Organization, and the Milk Processors Organization of South Africa. And basically what we do is we run 20 different projects, of which the one is the backbone of our whole setup is the actual monitoring of milk and other dairy products, basically to promote the improvement of compliance in terms of food safety, product compositional and metrology standards. So following that, we also do a lot of risk identification within the organized dairy industry. We do consumer complaints. We are also very much involved in liaison with legislation, collaborating with the health authorities, all the different authorities involved in the regulatory discipline. And this, we're very much involved through the dairy value chain by means of auditing at farm level, milk production level, working through the entire value chain by means of integrated chain management approach.
Thanks, Yompi.
Good morning. My name is Gerard Neertling. I'm a veterinarian and I'm the manager of the Red Meat Abattoir Association. We spend about 70% of our time training the abattoir industry on preventing environmental contamination to our product, and the other 30% we spend trying to convince the department to implement proper monitoring procedures for these aspects.
Thank you, correct. Yeah?
Yes, please.
I'm Zianda Majogweni. I'm also a veterinarian. I see you've got the veterinarians in the corner here. I come from the South African Poultry Association. And what the association does is that it represents the bulk of the poultry industry, both from broiler and an egg or layer perspective. And what we do as an association is we do advocacy for the industry, but we also assist them in making decisions on in areas particularly that need collective decision making. So the areas of intervention, they're as broad as trade to animal disease control. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Sianda. You can pass it back down that way. Right, I'd like to ask the question as a concerned consumer. So as a concerned consumer, because I'm sure you've all been very involved in having to provide information with this outbreak, as a concerned consumer, we have heard a lot about dairy products. We've heard a lot about chicken in the press. So if I had to ask Zianda, with regards to the mechanisms that are in place to assist the sector with controlling and preventing listeria, what would you tell me as a consumer of chicken?
I think what's important is the fact that the industry recognizes that its consumers are very important, and without the consumer, there would be no industry. That's the first principle that I think we adhere to. We follow this right through the value chain. Obviously, other aspects of the value chain are not within the control of the industry, but we try to advise and to assist where we can. On the farm level, there's a number of interventions that are put in place as broad as disease detection, because listeriosis is not really a significant disease of poultry, but we understand the food safety aspects or the food safety importance of the disease. So what we do on farm, we make sure that we reduce the total pathogen counts. We do cleaning and disinfection. Similarly, at abattoir level and further processing of goods, we monitor, and most of those are actually voluntary or requested by clients. So the industry has been very proactive in looking at programs that actually reduce the pathogen within the environment to make sure that the food that the industry churns out is safe for the consumers to eat.
Thank you, Sianda. We were informed this morning by Lucia that there was a request for information made to industry with regards to isolates and the results of tests. Matlau, I am aware that a similar letter was sent out to all the members of the Consumer Goods Council to share information in the same way as SAFOS members were requested. Could you give us an indication, what was the level of response from industry to share information?
Okay, that's always a difficult one to talk about, because we've got a responsibility to not really protect the member base, but we cannot give the statistics out there because we do not represent the whole of the industry. We've got a certain number that have voluntarily joined the CGCSA as a member. So basically what we did, the process, we alerted the members to say, this is the request that has come forth, and the request is that they will treat any information that is provided to the department and the NICD with the strict text confidentiality. They were comfortable with that. Information came flooding. I must say I applaud the industry for the information they forwarded, because from where I'm sitting, having worked in the industry, for a decision to be taken to have a positive result of a particular product willingly given to the authorities, that's a bit scary. But that was done, and we have been engaging with the NICD even after the call. When we've made the call and we forwarded the information, industry members came back again to say, we've upped our testing. They sent back the results. There is the results that were positive before. When they sent back a retest indication to say, this is what we came up with. Whenever they would pick up, I remember there was a case where a supplier alerted a certain retailer, and they said, you can come and sample so that you do it on your own terms, so that you don't take our weight. So it's been very positive. We just can't really quantify it. Yeah.
Of course, but I think at the end of the day, I think we all want to know maybe that we're doing the right thing, from that perspective. Because there have been comments made in the updates from the NICD that there has been a reluctance from certain sectors to actually release information, which is unfortunate, because if we can assist in finding the source of the outbreak, should we not be doing everything we possibly can? The environmental health practitioners have been dispatched to go and do investigations. So we heard yesterday from Blaine how Sovereign Foods experienced this process. I'd like to ask, when it comes to the sampling of products, Alida, has there been any experience within your members with regards to the EHPs coming in to take samples, and how has this process been sort of carried out in terms of cooperation?
Yes, several of our members have been approached, and they have been on site. It was involved with site visits, walk through factory, taking swabs, and also going away with product. In most instances, it was well received. They were most welcome, and there was no resistance from the members.
Great, thank you. Yompi, what about your sector? Have you had similar experiences in the dairy sector?
Yes, the environmental health practitioners did indeed visit, and they still continue to visit the facilities. Now, looking at our spectrum, obviously some of the factories are large, some are small and so on, but I think we also participate in a program with the environmental health practitioners where we sample product in the retail. So part of our risk identification problem is a project is to go along, schedule the work. We are in service level agreements with the health inspectors, and then they go to the facilities and also in the retail and sample certain dairy products as we ask them to do, and also in a risk-based approach. And then we collect that according to very strict protocol, and we have it analyzed by outsourced laboratories, and those results are then, information is made known to us, which we then obviously share with the authorities. So yes, the AHPs are there. There's always this concern about the levels of competency in the way that the samples are being taken, how representative it is. But yes, indeed, they are there, and I think in a way one can become skeptical about what also we've heard yesterday, but we should rather than, as an industry, support them and encourage them to do the right thing. So that is very much what we do all along, is to help the environmental health practitioners to understand dairy, and actually that it's quite a unique ready-to-eat product.
Jane, what about the restaurant sector? Has there been any monitoring that you're aware of? Is it a sector that's been targeted? There was another news bulletin that was released to say that there was a particular sort of a food service outlet that had been identified as a potential source.
In general, no. There's been very low activity in terms of sampling activities at that level. Very much isolated. I think the food service sector can be broken up into a number of different components. Restaurants, obviously, very consumer-facing and retail-facing. And then there's a very large proponent of food service that is quite, it's a bit of a grey area. And that's sort of your in-house restaurants and staff catering and staff restaurant facilities. Obviously, hospital catering gets a big attention. I do know that there was a bit of surveillance in the one private healthcare group. But in general, it's a bit of a grey area. So there's who owns the facility, who manages it, who runs it. In the contract food service sector, there's been a little bit of activity and inquiry in terms of listeriosis. But certainly what I've picked up is that there's quite a large amount of ignorance as to what is this really, and what are we dealing with, and how should we be dealing it. So that terminology, listeria, hysteria, is very prevalent in this sector because we're dealing with people that might not be technically competent. They have a passion for food, they have a passion for service, and that service culture kind of runs away from complaint, and we don't like to know about it. And there's a major pushback from that sector towards supply chain and manufacture, and where the responsibility sits within that link is a big issue. So food service will push back to supplier. Distributors will say, well, I just move boxes around at the right temperatures at the right time, and the manufacturer then is left totally exposed. Very little consideration is being given to the fact that once that ingredient product arrives in a food service establishment, the potential for adulteration is enormous. And that's where the education is very poor and lacking.
Absolutely. I think, we saw a case study where you have recontamination when you take a processed meat, for example, and it's sliced. And so, where is it being sliced? And is that at the facility? Probably not. It's probably being, sliced in some food service kind of outlet where there could then be that potential cross-contamination. Okay, let's talk about the numbers game, because I think everybody was very concerned about that. We've heard lots of different numbers. We've heard the American numbers, we've heard the EU numbers, we've heard the South African numbers, or lack thereof. What levels are there in industry that we have to work from? So now we're looking at you to say, well, what are our numbers? What can we have? What numbers have been established for the particular sector? So there's two things I'd like to know. What are the allowable levels in your sector? Are there guidelines? So yes, I appreciate that there's legislation in some cases. Are there guidelines to your members? And then secondly, are there guidelines relating to the test methods? Because yesterday we heard a lot of concern about how products are tested, what tests I request from the laboratory. So two questions. Are there guidelines relating to permissible levels of Listeria, and what test methods are advocated in the sector? Alida, we'll start with you.
Okay, when we posed this question to our members specifically on environmental, there seems to be some indecisiveness on the environmental levels. However, if you look at products, we do have in SANS 885, we do recommend specific levels with regard to Listeria, which we actually have done in a working group with stakeholders, and Professor Lucia Annelich was involved in that at that stage. So on product, we have clear indication with reference methods. But on the environment, there seems to be a bit of it's basically where someone can go and get information from. But from the moment, it doesn't seem that there's something specific.
Thank you. Jane, on your side?
Well, the product range is so broad and specific that I think in general there's no guideline other than the specific product category that would relate to product specifically, but certainly not environment. And the synopsis is absent. There's virtual no tolerance on any of the products sampling that I've been exposed to recently. So there's a lot of uncertainty about whether when it's detective, it must be absent, it cannot be present, and then shut down supply, discontinue supplier, extreme measures versus, okay, what are the guidelines, what are the controls? So people are drawing on all pieces of information from all over the world, and there doesn't seem to be anything generic.
Perfect. Matlau, what about from the retail perspective or manufacturing in terms of the member base? Is there anything coming from the CGCSA?
Like Jane said, it's just a broad subject to just pin down. But there's room for improvement. We could work on that, especially we have fallen back on legislation, like you said, is there. But we could do more, basically looking at the work that's going to be happening with the new regulation that is due to be drafted. Possibly after this outbreak, it will get a push for them to concentrate on that one. Because legislation is very key. Either we get any guidance from all the other places, but we just need to emphasize legislation compliance. Working with government is key, because from where we're standing now, not having the data to trace back, it's a high concern for us, which we will communicate at high level in that regard.
Absolutely. Yonke?
I think with regards to the dairy industry, we're quite fortunate in terms of the Foodstuffs Act that we've got our own set of regulations, 1555, although it dates back to 1997. But there is also a zero tolerance towards pathogens in final product, whether it's now raw or processed. So in industry, we've also adopted the final product standard to be zero in 25 grams. And that is what we maintain in our guideline documentation as well. Matlo mentioned the draft regulation is out there. The Food Legislative Advisory Group is meeting soon, and I think that specific regulation relating to the microbiological standards will definitely be shifted on as a high priority.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's the case. Gerard, what about raw meat? Because we heard lots of discussion, debate. Lucia made the point this morning about, in terms of raw product, the likelihood is far higher, but that's possibly not where we should be focusing as much attention. What's your take in terms of red meat?
Yeah, I can just say that we also have to rely on legislation and in many cases also international legislation for our exporters, the requirements by our the importing countries. We had a workshop. The department issued a draft document on sampling for pathogens at abattoirs, and we had a discussion on the 28th of January with the department. And it was interesting that the decision that was taken there, or the recommendation to the department, was that, first of all, that they should not in the program concentrate only on pathogens in testing, but to do the environmental sampling. I think we've heard this again today. But also, secondly, that Listeria will possibly not be on that list to be tested at abattoirs. And should there be a risk or risk identifier, that an abattoir then should include Listeria, but it might not be needed on a routine basis, and definitely not for the product, possibly for the environment. at the abattoirs. And we hope that we will get those guidelines soon. As an industry, we issue guidelines at this stage to our abattoir owners to indicate that they should, as a measure of precaution, do test for listeria, but in the environmental samples only.
Thank you. What about chicken?
I think in the poultry industry, it's very similar to what has been spoken about by Gerard, so I won't repeat that. Again, we're also governed by the same process with DAF, them trying to set standards at abattoir level. But in terms of further processed goods, basically they would follow the SAN standards still. As I said, it's very much voluntary as well as what clients require. So it's still at that stage. So we most definitely do need set guidelines. And I think the fragmentation in the legislation also creates that gap.
Absolutely. I think we haven't got long enough to talk about that, but I think we all agree with you in that respect. Last question. We have the infamous Regulation 908, which is our HACCP regulation. And we heard yesterday that, tragically, the only place where HACCP is a mandatory requirement in South Africa is peanut butter processing and the sorting of peanuts. So I'd now like to put it to the sectors in terms of, if coming out of the flag meeting and this Listeria outbreak, there should be a revision of Regulation 908, and more sectors are now required to have mandatory HACCP in place, a mandatory HACCP system that has been appropriately certified by a SANAS accredited facility according to the current regulation. Is it something that the sector would accept, and how ready are we? So let's start on that side again.
On our sector, we're definitely ready for it, and it should actually be something that should be implemented.
We definitely don't have long enough to talk about this across all the categories. Food service is, I think, one of the most vulnerable sectors. Certainly, when you look at the supply chain involvement all the way through to the end product production of a meal in a restaurant or a food service facility. Will HACCP be will the industry sector be ready for it? No, definitely not. There's a lot of ground foundation work that needs to be done, and very specifically, there would have to be focus in specific areas. I think the biggest challenge of that is in more the informal sector is the frequent changing of hands and the low skill levels of the staff, and the education that is required to handle multiple categories of products in a fixed environment and the risk of contamination. So I think lots of good work to be done on that foundation level, but whether or not that sector is ready for, the food service per se is ready for HACCP implementation is questionable. I certainly think the role players and stakeholders within the supply chain, definitely that would be an easy one to answer and say yes. Most of the players are already beyond the HACCP standard level, and certainly from a distribution point, that wouldn't be too much of a material issue at all.
Thanks, Jane. McLeod, what do you think in terms of manufacturers?
Okay, I think Jane has already captured that well in terms of the well-known leading retailers and manufacturers. They are quite ready, there's no doubt about that. And I'm sitting next to her, and I owe her a deliverable. As I'm sitting here and listening, I'm like, that's one focus area that's sitting close to her heart in terms of getting a communication around those lower level value chain people like your food service people, like she's saying. And also, in addition to that, another focus that the CGCSA is looking into is having a product offering for the SMMEs. That's what we currently working on in conjunction with the GS1 standards, because in terms of the barcoding and the traceability, if we link the legislative compliance and the food safety knowledge to the SMME, so that we just have everyone, not just the bigger role players, knowledgeable about this food safety thing. Yeah.
I think also the framework that you have within the FSI does provide for a stepwise progression towards some sort of HACCP-based system. And, in terms of that process, we may not be ready now, but at least we have a framework that we could use if the regulation was to change and to affect, multiple sectors that may be under your jurisdiction. Yompi, what about cream, cheese, ice cream, and milk?
Aye.
Especially ice cream after Bluebell.
Can we rather talk about politics? I think it's easier. No,
I hope there's no ice cream for dessert, because I think we'll all give it a wide berth.
I think the dairy industry's got a very unique value chain. We sit with approximately 1,500 commercial dairy farmers in this country, organized, well-disciplined people, know their subject, and we are blessed in that respect. They produce more than 300 billion or 1.1 billion liters of milk.
That's why I didn't even try those numbers.
So that's fantastic to think that milk flows to approximately 275 processors in this country. Out of that 275, we work on an 80-20 principle, where the top 20 is actually producing more than 80% of the products that we find in the retail. And retail refers obviously to our top 6 retailers in the country. So we absolutely follow a philosophical approach towards this whole thing. It's integrated chain management. We all have to manage our own risks. We start basically at feed production, feed manufacturing, and then we take it to the farmers to say that you have got a huge responsibility because your output becomes the manufacturer's input. So that whole line of communication past the retailer to the consumer, those between the pillars that we refer to, those 6 pillars, there's got to be a lot of communication taking place in terms of what is my expectation, Mr. Farmer, what are you bringing into my factory environment? And we've gone to the extreme where we've written guidelines. Linda, you've been so part and parcel of this whole process. We've written a code of practice for the milk producers of South Africa, for the secondary industry, and the nice part is that we've already aligned ourselves with the GFSI, as you're aware, for the smaller people. How would we react to 908? I think referring to the top 20, they are basically all on FSCC 22000 ISO, and on that level, the remainder of the guys will actually be part of the process. Because we can say, again, where we are now, HACCP should be a legal compliant issue, it should be mandatory, but who's going to enforce it? Whilst we already know that we struggle with the EHPs to enforce this whole process. The way that we see it, it's an industry thing. Foodstuffs already says the Act says you shall not. So it starts with us. We have to create that culture within the dairy industry of being compliant, not to wait for the government to catch us out. That's a bad culture, and we should change that wherever that exists. So we would welcome that. We as an industry will support that through the systems that we already have working on the Global Markets Program as well.
Thank you. Gerard?
Linda, as far as HACCP is concerned, the principles of HACCP is actually very well entrenched in the red meat and poultry regulations, game meat regulations that comes from 2004 already. And there's really not a problem. It's once again the same problem. It's the one about enforcement. And in that regard, I must say that at least after a fight of 17 years, the Department of Agriculture actually appointed agencies in terms of the Meat Safety Act on the 1st of January 2018 that will now take over the responsibility to an extent of the department for meat inspection and regulatory control at all abattoirs. And we see that as a very positive step in our environment, provided that the agencies are well controlled to provide the service that they're expected to do on behalf of industry and our consumers. So it's not a matter about HACCP, the principles not being there. We have an extensive list of, for instance, good manufacturing practices in our regulations. It is just not applied. It was mentioned also earlier here. If we do external audits at facilities, you see these results and you ask what's been done about it. Well, the answer is, well, what are you talking about? You know, I didn't even know that I have a problem. So yes, it's all about enforcement.
Thanks, Gerard. Similarly, within the poultry industry, as Gerard had indicated, I think for us, from a principal perspective, we are committed to food safety. as an industry. That is undoubted. Secondly, where we set standards that the industry has to adhere to, it most definitely has to be based on sound science, and it has to be risk-based. So it has to manage the risk that it intends to do that. I think, Matlo, you alluded to this, that sometimes you have members at different levels. So it is then important for us that when we do enforce or do the implementation, it ensures that when we have those smaller producers, that they are able to comply with the standard and they're allowed the space and the time to implement.
Great. So I think I was right in saying that we have the frameworks. We have the frameworks in the country. We have the support processes within the country. I think there are a couple of challenges, but I would first of all not be surprised if the scope of Regulation 908 is changed based on this outbreak. Once possibly the source is identified, I think the brush should sweep wider than just the location of the source in terms of the sectors. I think what the other aspect is, we have a fairly good case, I think, to bring to government to say that if that regulation was to be changed, the support structures are here, and we could support the implementation of HACCP within the various sectors because of the roles that the associations actually play. And I would hope that we would support the government if they were to actually make that change. I think we all want to see a change in legislation. The question I wanted to know is, how ready are we for the enforcement? Enforcement is one aspect, but how ready are we for the implementation of that legislation?